everyone, welcome back to Underreported Stories, where I cover the news that CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News fail to report or don't report on enough. And today, I have an exclusive story that you literally won't hear anywhere else because I'm the first person to report it, hence exclusivity. It's crazy. It's about an alleged racism hoax that took place, and then a white counselor demeaned a minority student for denying that racism hoax. So we'll get into the details there. We also have a story on a Latino political group bribing Latinos to endorse Kamala, and also some shocking news that debunks the main justification for gender-affirming care for minors. So, without further ado, let's get into the 5 underreported stories that you need to know. A freshman advisor at Utah Valley University claimed that a young minority student was uneducated for denying that she had experienced racism after the student's father perpetuated a minor racism hoax. Again, this is my exclusive story, so I'm going to pull up the Substack Underreported Stories where I detail this out for you. If you'd like to follow along my work, it is just linked in the description down there. It's just underreportedstories.substack.com. Okay, again, this says exclusive. White counselor calls minority student uneducated for denying racism hoax. So this counselor, her name is Elaine Lewis, and she's the director of freshman advisors at UVU. She can be heard in a Zoom call with other university directors describing how a young minority student was apologetic for her father's allegations of racism against the university. So let me lay out the allegations for you. The father alleged in a one-on-one meeting with his daughter and Lewis that the college denied his child residency status because it, quote, racially profiled her last name. So we're insinuating here that she's got a foreign-sounding last name. However, just so you know, universities are actually not the ones responsible for allocating residency status. Rather, it's the state that will bear this responsibility, so you have to get a driver's license, proof of residency from the state, and then the school will honor that. But what the father did was just jump to the conclusion that the school had racially profiled against her daughter or his daughter because of her last name. This is according to video footage I obtained from a source who was at the meeting, said, quote, the dad felt very strongly that the student was being racially profiled and that the non-residency status was based purely on the student's last name. So obviously this was not racism being perpetuated. What it actually was just the father and child's inability to get residency status. And it was probably some frustration coming from that. But according to the counselor's version of this story, the student then began apologizing for her dad's false accusations of racism against the university. Now, she doesn't need to take on the responsibility of her dad's actions, but of course I get where she's coming from. I would be apologetic if my mom or dad said something that was maybe embarrassing while I was the one sitting in person. So again, Elaine Lewis, she's a white woman. She proceeded to explain to this minority student how her father's, what we're going to call a racism hoax, because there was no evidence of racism. It was just jumping to conclusions. But Elaine Lewis called this a, quote, really, really powerful thing. This is what she said. Your dad really has experienced racism. And it was so interesting. The student immediately said, I've never experienced that. So the student said, quote, I've never experienced, end quote, but she was referring to racism. She's never experienced racism. And she's probably 18 or 19 years old, maybe lowest 17 years old because she's a freshman. And this is a freshman advisor. And so Elaine Lewis goes on to say, she's probably just hasn't been educated to know that she has probably experienced racism. I did obtain some exclusive footage of this interaction, so I'm going to play that for you real quick.
Apologized to me. And she said, oh, I'm so sorry about my dad. He has experienced racism and he doesn't know how to behave. I'm so embarrassed by him. It was really, really apologetic. But it was a really great learning opportunity for the student and I to have, the dad was actually on the phone and the student was in person, so the dad wasn't there for this part, to have this conversation of, racism is a real thing. Your dad really has experienced that. And it was so interesting. The student immediately said, I've never experienced it. And that she probably just hasn't been educated to know that she has probably.
So I'm going to put my leftist logic cap on here. And in my mind, I'm like, this would be very offensive to tell a student of minority status that her experience of racism is a lie. Like, if I'm living in leftist la la land, shouldn't we believe that this person, because of her skin color, we have to believe her truth and her journey? Or we can't believe her because what she's experienced doesn't perpetuate the nasty lies of DEI. That's what this story exposes, that only the correct minority voices are propped up by the DEI administrative state, and wrong thinkers like this courageous young woman are told to shut up and get educated enough to become a victim. It's crazy. If you also have an exclusive story that you want to share with me, you can always email me and I will do my best to get it out in a timely fashion. You can email me, Chrissy@underreportedstories.co. That's co, not com. It's Chrissy@underreportedstories.co to send tips and get featured on Underreported Stories. Next up, we have some reporting from my TPUSA pal, Savannah Hernandez. So a Latino political organization posted a Craigslist ad offering $1,000 to voters who will publicly endorse Kamala Harris. The organization is called Voto Latino, and it's a nonprofit that is supposed to register all Latinos to vote, but instead it's opted to use its influence to pay people to publicly endorse Kamala. Savannah put out a whole tweet thread on this, so we're going to run through that slowly but surely so that you get all the aspects of this story. So like Sav says, Voto Latina is an organization that targets, quote, Latinx voters, so we can already tell from that word where they stand politically. And they put an ad out on Craigslist offering to pay swing voters up to $1,000 if they join their social media campaign and publicly endorse Kamala. The organization is looking for former Latino Trump supporters that are now going to be voting for Kamala Harris. They're offering $100 for an initial interview and up to $1,000 if voters are willing to publicly share that they once supported Trump but are now voting for Kamala. You can see this is kind of the Google Doc right here that she had access to. And Savannah goes on to say this is not the organization, it's just Savannah reporting, saying that this is another example of the Democratic Party trying to pay influencers and voters to publicly support the current Democratic ticket. Voto Latino also has $44 million given to the largest Latino-focused registration and turnout campaign in U.S. history. That's what they've committed, the $44 million. They've committed to endorsing Kamala Harris for president. This is the same organization that has worked to stop proof of citizenship laws. So they don't want you to have to show that you're a citizen in order to vote in U.S. elections. They also stopped the Clean Elections Act, or Clean Elections USA, which is an organization that stops people from engaging in certain Dropbox monitoring activities. So they want to put restraining orders on people that want to ensure that people are only dropping off their ballots at ballot boxes. And then they even invested $1 million. This is Voto Latino. Again, they invested $1 million to stop the recall efforts against Governor Gavin Newsom back in 2021. They, quote, mobilized 600,000 young Latinx voters in the state, helping to stop the recall against Gavin Newsom for doing a quite piss poor job, if I do say so myself. And in my mind, the next logical step to this is paying people to get out and vote. Like, if we're paying people to provide testimony that they otherwise wouldn't do to influence an election, don't you think that the next logical step would be paying people to vote when they otherwise wouldn't? I was reading the comments on Savannah's post too, and a lot of them were asking whether this is legal. So I went and did a little bit of research, and obviously with some background knowledge too. I do not believe that there's anything illegal with compensating people for their time for an interview. Now, I will say that doesn't mean it's not incredibly deceptive and inauthentic, but I don't think it's illegal. Speaking of inauthentic, that's a word you'd never use to describe this show. So if you like the original and honest reporting you get here, please be sure to like, subscribe, and comment if you're watching this on YouTube, Rumble, or X. If you're in the listening audience, be sure to give this show a 5-star review. It helps boost us in the algorithm. All right, on to our third story. The rationale for gender-affirming care for minors in the U.S. has always been that, quote, all major U.S. medical associations support it. But big news, the American Society of Plastic Surgeons just became the first major medical association to break from this consensus. That's big news. I hope I'm saying this guy's name right, but Lior Sapir, he's a fellow at the Manhattan Institute, which is a kind of, I would say, sort of right-leaning nonprofit. But he did a whole breakdown about this breaking news about the American Society of Plastic Surgeons. Again, this is an organization that represents 92% of all board-certified plastic surgeons in the U.S. And they are the first medical association to break from this consensus of gender-affirming care for minors. So, Lior's thread does a really good job. So just kind of stick with me as we go through this entire thread because it's worth it. So he says in the US, the use of puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries to help kids who feel distressed about their developing bodies has depended on a perceived consensus of medical groups. So part of the rationale for saying gender-affirming care is the only model that doctors are using is because there is a consensus among doctors. But this is the first group that we're seeing that goes, wait, no. So critics, such as myself, argue that the consensus is manufactured and enforced through suppression of alternative viewpoints and of evidence reviews. The American Academy of Pediatrics, for instance, has suppressed members' initiative to get the group to conduct a systematic review of the evidence. We've talked about this on the show before, that there are no systematic reviews of this evidence. There's very little actual evidence to showcase that the current model of gender-affirming care is the best model. Therefore, we've all kind of gone off this consensus. Maybe I don't really want to include myself in that, but doctors have gone on the consensus of medical groups. But now we have, again, a medical group walking away. The consensus of medical associations is a chief reason for the growing divide between what's happening with gender-affirming care in the US and in Europe. Europe and countries across Europe have reversed course on youth gender medicine after finding the evidence too weak to support the routine use of these drugs. Court documents recently revealed that the World Association of Transgender Health suppressed systemic reviews of evidence and eliminated age minimums for surgery under the pressure from Joe Biden's HHS, Health and Human Services Director, Rachel Levine. WPATH is the source of the U.S. consensus, right? So it's written a ton of guidelines. It is the premier source that doctors use to deal with gender-affirming care guidelines, right? So Lior reached out to the American Plastic Surgeons Association for comment on why it's recognized that WPATH and the current world order of gender-affirming care will say why they've kind of seen this as problematic. And the group said it is, quote, low quality evidence for drugs. So it emphasized that it never endorsed WPATH standard of care or other similar documents. So they are maybe not necessarily coming out and saying, oh, we no longer endorse this. They're just claiming they never endorsed it while simultaneously never speaking out and saying they didn't endorse it till today. But we've had plenty of organizations in Europe specifically come out and say that what is happening with gender-affirming care is incredibly problematic. And it appears as the ASPS is kind of realizing now that they need better guidance because, of course, this is a plastic surgeons association. So these are people that would be doing some of these plastic surgeries for potential minors. I don't want to incriminate anybody, but potentially could be. I'm going to be very sparing in my commentary here, but I will say that when I see stories like this, I am hopeful that we are turning a corner and pushing back on this life-altering surgery because they're made out to be solely life-saving, but they really are life-altering. Okay, moving on to something a little less depressing. A former CNN anchor and current Democratic candidate reportedly evaded his taxes by claiming that his primary residence is in Manhattan while also telling voters he lives on Long Island. John Avlon has a history of missing property tax payments and has reportedly netted more than $2,000 a year in abatements by claiming his primary residence is in New York City while propping himself up as the man of the people on Long Island. This article reads, ex-CNN anchor, Dem candidate John Avlon evaded taxes, scored abatements on NYC condo while claiming a Sag Harbor residency. Now, I'm not from New York, so I'm going to try and read this like a New Yorker. It's just not easy for me because I don't truly understand the geography up there, but I'm going to try, okay? New Yorkers don't come for me. The article says Avlon is running to represent New York's 1st congressional district And his campaign told the New York Post that he's living in Sag Harbor, which I believe is on Long Island. So this is where he says he lives, but research from multiple news outlets, including the New York Post, show that Avalon appears to be raking in about $16,000 in tax abatements for his $3.36 million Gramercy Park co-op unit, according to the New York City Department of Finance records, despite the savings only being eligible to units designated as a primary residence. So kind of mumbo jumbo information there. Basically, what's happening here is Avalon is taking tax abatements on his co-op unit, but in order to get those abatements, you have to be living in it. It has to be your primary residence. So he has it listed as his primary residence, but he allegedly lives in Sag Harbor. The article goes on to say he and his wife, Margaret Hoover, she's the host of Firing Lines on PBS, purchased the Manhattan condo in 2015 when he was serving as editor-in-chief of the Daily Beast, but the couple wouldn't own the roughly $1.5 million Sag Harbor residence for another 2 years. So in 2017, they purchased a Sag Harbor property for about $1.5 million. But that, I believe, that Sag Harbor property, I believe, was rented out in the interim. So he was actually living in Manhattan, but he owned this. But now he wants the people to think that he's always lived in Sag Harbor and that the New York property isn't his. But it's so confusing, you know? So reports from the Free Beacon and Smithtown Messenger confirmed that 2017 purchase of the Southampton home and the latter outlet was the first to reveal the city records of the tax abatement to the Gramercy Park Co-op. And if you're in the listening audience, you can't see this, obviously, but for our viewing audience, this is what the property looks like. So to clarify this, because it is a very confusing story, basically John Avalon claims the Manhattan property as his primary residence for tax purposes. And he likely did live in that Manhattan property as his primary residence until it became politically convenient for him to move out to his Long Island residency, which he's been renting out. And now the Long Island residency is his primary residency, but he doesn't want to change that information because he's evading taxes and netting abatements this way. And honestly, game respects game. This would be hella impressive if he wasn't running for office because, I mean, come on, how dumb can you be? Every opponent and decent reporter out there is going to be digging up dirt on you. You better be clean as a whistle or just take care of this. You have a tax guy for this? Both of you are famous news anchors. Like, get your shit together. And for our final story, Seattle Children's Hospital forced doctors to attend a racially segregated diversity training that asked Black doctors to acknowledge that they're systemically targeted for demise, aka victims, and also asked white doctors to tap into their repressed racial memories to develop a white race consciousness, aka nonsense. Reporting from Aaron Sibarium over at the Washington Free Beacon really dives into this training that took place at Seattle Children's Hospital. This was held back in August of 2022, so not necessarily recently, and probably in part in light of the Black Lives Matter movement that was still really a lot more culturally relevant than it is right now, but worth going through nonetheless, because this training was mandatory for the gastroenterology department and divided participants into three, quote, racial caucuses, a white caucus, a black caucus, and a non-black POC, which means people of color caucus, to, quote, minimize harm to our Black learners and facilitators. And there's really just a bunch of woke crap put on a PowerPoint slides, but what was happening is that each caucus had to complete some sort of racial identity development exercises. So the Black caucus was asked things like, how do you work against internalizing anti-Black messages? And for the non-Black POC people, they were asked to consider which of your actions are anti-Black and how Black people will always be more susceptible to structural racism than other non-Black people of color. So even the non-Black POC are still not victim enough. It's comical. And then the white doctors were asked how they were going to divest from their whiteness and unpack their racial stories by drawing on these repressed racial memories. I have no idea what that is. If you know what that is, chime in the comments because I have no clue what's going on. And I guess they were also asked to commit to practicing racial storytelling with at least one other white person. I would be so offended if I was a part of this. I'd be like, what the fuck? I don't know how people deal with this kind of stuff. But the training, I guess, offers a window into how one of obviously the top-ranked pediatric hospitals in the country has made racial identity a touchstone of its diversity efforts. They have crazy scholarships, and they offer a microaggression reporting system for medical students, which is really just tattletaling on peers. It's quite crazy. There was one part of this article. Give me 1 second. Right here. It says, at Seattle Children's Hospital, which is affiliated with the University of Washington School of Medicine, stomach doctors are encouraged to self-segregate even after the training has ended. It says BIPOC learners should commit to immersing themselves, quote, in racial ethnic experiences in group setting, while, quote, white learners should work with other white people to foster racial identity formation. So they're really just encouraging segregation or resegregation. This is the kind of crap that makes everyone more racist and feel like people of other races are othered. It's just like it's not helpful to resegregate the population. And yet somehow if you're anti-segregation, you're anti-black. Like, square that circle for me, please. Or circle that square for me. I don't know. Which one is it? I think it's circle that square. I don't know. Either way, none of this makes sense to me. But if you want merch that represents values that do make sense, please be sure to snag a hat from my new merch line, Based Apparel. Being based is the opposite of being woke, right? We're based in logic, facts, and truth. And I know it is difficult times, and it's a big ask of you to get people to spend money. But if you want to support this show and my independent journalism, which I showcased at the top of this is a really great way to do it. So thank you so much. And if you're a real story seeker and made it to the end of the show, please drop the hospital emoji to represent our 2 big stories about gender-affirming care in hospitals and racism training in hospitals. I'll see you guys back here next time. Thanks so much for watching. If you liked what you heard, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up and leave a comment about how beautiful, stunning, and funny I am. And if you want more content based in logic, be sure to click over here for more videos and clips of my show. If you have the means to financially support the show, consider purchasing from my merch line, Based Apparel, linked right below. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you back here next time. Bye, friends.